Putin really isn't the tough guy that can come in and save his pal, his friend, Assad, when the going gets tough. And if Putin doesn't look like a tough guy, then he's got a lot of other problems at home.
You are normally introduced as one of the archest of all Vladimir Putin's critics. For people who don't know enough about you, perhaps don't know as much as they should, how have you achieved that title? What's your definition of why you are called one of his archest critics?
So I was once living in Russia and running the largest foreign investment fund in Russia. I uncovered massive corruption in the companies I was investing in. I exposed that corruption. In retaliation, I was expelled from the country. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was then arrested, tortured, and killed in Russian police custody. And after his murder, I went on a mission to get justice, which led to something called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act freezes the assets and bans the travel of human rights violators and kleptocrats in Russia. The Magnitsky Act was passed in the United States in 2012, in the UK in 2018, and now exists in 35 countries around the world. And since Vladimir Putin is a human rights violator and a kleptocrat, and he keeps a lot of his money abroad, I put his whole fortune at risk. And so he hates my guts because his entire kleptocratic business model has been disrupted by this legislation that I was responsible for.
He does hate your guts. I know you've been asked this before, but I've got to ask it again. Are you safe?
I don't believe that when Putin hates your guts, you're safe by any means. I try to take as many precautions as I can. And so far, I've survived. A lot of my friends and allies in this fight have not. As I mentioned, my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was killed. My friend Boris Nemtsov, who helped me lobby for the Magnitsky Act, was killed. My friend Alexei Navalny, who was a great partner in our anti-corruption fights, was killed. And that's not to mention many, many others. It's a dangerous, dangerous business to cross Vladimir Putin. He's a mafia boss. He's a murderer. He's a serial killer, really. And so I just have to do whatever I can to try to stay safe. And I don't have a particularly normal life compared to everybody else.
This hasn't been a great couple of weeks for Vladimir Putin or for his regime. With the fall of Assad, are we completely wrong to be mildly optimistic about the chances of him being toppled, possibly even quite soon?
Well, I think that may be an over-optimistic projection. I think we can say that the bad guys in the world have had a bad week. I don't think, these bad guys like Vladimir Putin can have bad weeks or bad months or even bad years, and they bounce back. And remember, after Putin invaded Crimea and he went to the G20 meeting, he sat by himself at lunch because he was shunned by every world leader, and we all thought that's the total isolation of Vladimir Putin. And then somehow he was able to, sort of worm his way back into the good graces of at least some world leaders. And so I think that this is a very significant development, what happened with Assad, because Assad was Putin's man in Syria. And Putin had made the representation that he would do whatever he had to do to keep Assad in place. And for 13 years, that worked. But then, we ended up with this situation which completely, blew out of control for Assad and for Putin. And this has two really important, significant elements. The first is that what it shows is that Putin is materially stretched, that his war in Ukraine doesn't allow him to support his dictator friends, his client states in other countries, and that's significant. But the second thing, and I think this is even much more significant, is that Putin's entire model of dictatorship is to thump his chest, make all sorts of nasty threats all around the world, and look like a tough guy. And having Assad just basically blown away by a bunch of relatively poorly armed rebels shows that the king is not wearing any clothes, that Putin really isn't the tough guy that can come in and save his pal, his friend, Assad, when the going gets tough. And if Putin doesn't look like a tough guy, then he's got a lot of other problems at home. And so, possibly, maybe this inspires people who want to stand up to Putin to stand up to him. I don't know, but I think that the most important thing is that he's been shown to be the king not wearing any clothes.
What will the average Russian citizen know about what's happened in Syria and the part that Putin's regime played, or as it turned out, didn't play in it?
Well, I think that the average Russian citizen will see a very kind of rose-colored glasses view of what happened. I don't think that Russian state television can say nothing happened, but they can blame it on terrorists, they can blame it on other countries, they can blame it on the West. They tend to take all their failures and find a way to spin it so that the average Russian person doesn't think any less of Putin. But it's not the average Russian person that he needs to worry about. He needs to worry about the generals or some other person that he wants to have a go at him. And he also needs to worry about the Ukrainians who are, perhaps emboldened by this whole thing. And he also has to worry about what it looks like for the incoming White House. How does Trump view this situation in Syria? Does it make him look weaker? Does it make him look like somebody that Trump doesn't have to make concessions to?
Well,
And so,
Trump was in Notre Dame over the weekend at that wonderful ceremony, and the acclaim, the applause that Zelensky got, Trump will have seen that. He'll have heard it. He'll have felt it. Is he going to be just reassessing his view of how to bring about an end to the Ukraine-Russia war?
well, you're making a big assumption that Trump actually has a view going into this. I think that he probably will develop his view 30 minutes before he goes into whatever negotiating room there is with Zelensky and Putin. I don't think that Trump has a strong view. He has slogans. He says, we're going to end this war in 24 hours. We're going to make a deal, all that kind of stuff. But I don't think he has a view on how to really resolve this, because it's a very complicated situation. If it was so easy to resolve, it would have already been resolved a long time ago. And so, Putin, I believe, is at war in Ukraine for one simple reason. He needs a war of distraction so that the Russian people aren't mad at him. They're mad at a foreign enemy. And Zelensky's at war because Russian troops are killing their citizens and raping their women and kidnapping their children. And neither side can back off. The Ukrainians can't back off and say, okay, you can just kill all of us. That's no problem. And Putin believes that if he backs off, he looks weak, and that someone's going to come and knock him out of power. And Putin doesn't have the same benefit that Assad has. There's no country in the world that will give safe harbor to Putin if he collapses, because the West will want him, and whatever subsequent regime in Russia will want him. And I don't think anyone wants to stand up to the West and to Russia in a post-Putin era. So Putin really views this as sort of a life and death situation. He's got to keep this war going in order to stay in power and stay alive.
But I mean, even in Ukraine, he's dependent on these North Korean troops, isn't he? I mean, that's another illustration of how, as you said earlier, he's being really, really stretched.
Well, I mean, so this is probably the most interesting thing. So since the beginning of this war, he has refused to call it a war. He calls it a special military operation. Why does he call it a special military operation? Because that gives the impression to the Russian people, this is some kind of like minor thing going on the periphery. It doesn't really involve you. You can root for us, but that you don't really need to be thinking all that carefully about it. It doesn't affect your life. And so for as a result, there's not huge public opinion against this, quote, special military operation. But in order to keep it as a special military operation, as opposed to a war in the minds of the people, he can't impose a general conscription of soldiers. And this has created a huge problem because, according to the Ukrainian estimates, the Russians have lost 750,000 soldiers since this whole thing started, either death or severe disability. And so he's lost the entire sort of fighting force he started with. And so how has he replaced those people? Well, first he went to the prisons and he said, any prisoner who wants to fight in Ukraine can get out. And so they emptied out all the prisons, and all the prisoners went to Ukraine, and most of them died. Then he started going around the poorest regions of Russia and said to the people, we'll pay you money to come and be a contract soldier in Ukraine. And so a lot of poor people signed up, and then they were killed. And the most interesting thing is that they used to pay a bonus of $4,000 to get poor people to sign up to go and die in Ukraine. And now the price has gone up to $47,000. And so basically they've run out of people, run out of prisoners, run out of poor people that are ready to take the money. And they had to raise the money by more than 10 times. And so what do? They start, begging whoever they can to bring in more soldiers. And so now they're paying the North Koreans to send in their soldiers. Apparently there's Houthi soldiers in Russia. And as you said, that shows that this thing is not going well for Putin. And it's not just the soldier problem, but the economics are not going well in Russia. All these people who have died, all the people who have left, have created a huge shortage of workers. As a result, there's massive inflation. They have interest rates at 21%. Apparently, they're going to have to raise interest rates. The price of potatoes and butter has gone up by like 60%. And so for whatever impression Putin is trying to give that he's doing a great job and it's all going fine for him and we're the ones having problems. No, he's having some big problems as well, and all these things show it.
When the end comes for Putin, as it surely will, it will be somebody internal making a move. Now, there isn't exactly succession planning in a country like Russia. So have you any idea who that person or who those people might be?
Well, it really all depends on how Putin ends up losing power. If he dies in his sleep tonight, then the oligarchs and the security officials will all get together in the Kremlin and try to figure out how do we keep the whole Putin thing going, because there's so much money at stake. They've stolen such a large amount of money over such a long period of time that they would be afraid of having a sort of non-regime approved leader come in and take that money away from them. And so if he dies in his sleep, it's going to be sort of status quo. You could have a situation like we saw in June of 2023 when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, one of the most ruthless but effective military men, mercenaries, I should say, marched on Moscow. And that was a situation where it could have gone either way. The Russian people were not like standing in the way of Prigozhin's tanks ready to protect Vladimir Putin. The Russian people just wanted to know, who do they report to now? Or the third option is sort of the Syrian type of option, where the whole regime just collapses. All the Putin people get on their private jets and flee. A lot of them don't get out, and you have some kind of provisional government put together by the Russian opposition.
That's, and of course, you don't rule that out.
I don't rule it out. I think it's a low probability scenario, but it's a scenario for sure. It's not a zero probability scenario.
And the chances of a war between the West and Russia, do you think they're higher or lower than they were at the start of this year?
Well, I think every day that goes by, they become lower because Putin is running out of resources to fight a war. If he can't take on Ukraine, how is he going to take on the West? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. I don't think that China wants to come in and go to war with the United States and in European countries over Russia. I don't think that makes any sense. And so Putin is sitting there, running out of resources. He can't protect his client states. He can't even fight effectively against Ukraine, which is a much smaller, much less resourced country. How in the hell is he going to have a war with the West? I mean, he knows he'll lose that in a matter of moments.
And other parts of the Putin project have got into difficulty. Romania, Georgia, the Russian state has tried to intervene, and it would seem that they've been found out.
Indeed, completely. So, Romania is a great example that a totally unknown, massively pro-Russian candidate for the presidency of Romania showed up, and then with a total deluge on all social media channels, was with Russian money bombarding those social media channels, he ended up winning in the first round of the presidential elections. And all the evidence of the Russians' involvement came to light very quickly. And their Supreme Court did the right thing, which is to say, why should Russia determine the outcome of our elections? And they nullified that round of elections. In Moldova, the same thing happened. In this case, there was no Supreme Court decision. That just the good guys beat the bad guys by like 51-49. We have a situation in Georgia right now. In Georgia, which Russia, by the way, invaded in 2008, and then annexed some part of the territory, and then put one of their own people in to run for president, a billionaire, to run for president. He won the presidency, and he then basically put his own people all over the place in government. And after the parliamentary elections a few weeks ago, Georgia then made an announcement to say that they're not going to be part of the European Union. They're going to cancel their joining plans. And what's happened? There's like hundreds of thousands of people on the street of Georgia protesting, very much like what we saw in Ukraine in 2014, the Maidan revolution, where the Ukrainian people, it's the exact same scenario where the Russian puppet at the time in Ukraine wanted to abandon the EU, sort of join up with Russia, and the people said, enough is enough, we don't want anything to do with you, and they took over the central square, the Maidan Square, and he ended up fleeing to Russia like Assad did. We don't know what's going to happen in Georgia, but it could go the wrong way. And so whenever there's like something like what happened in Syria, it's not an isolated incident. It shows that there's stress in the system, and often these things lead to other dominoes falling, and where those dominoes fall and where we should be looking, it's often hard to say. I mean, who was to have known that Syria would fall? I mean, it was we were all looking left, and that happened to the right. And so I think we don't know what's going to happen next, but this is a very brittle time, and potentially, not a great time for Vladimir Putin.
Now, Ukraine they're in pursuit of its first ballistic missile in the city of Dnipro, a plant there. George Grills knows a lot about this now. He's the defense and political correspondent. He's visited the factory where this missile is being created. Hello, George.
Hi there.
Hi, tell us more about the production, the development of what would be, I guess, a powerful weapon.
So it's worth thinking about the political context right now. Donald Trump is about to become US president, and he's said that he wants to end the war in Ukraine, and he wants peace negotiations to start. Now, the Ukrainians want NATO membership, but it seems pretty unlikely that they'll get it. So they've got to think about other ways of deterrence. Bear in mind, Russia invaded for the first time in 2014. They invaded again in 2022. Even if the fighting stops, what's to stop the Russians invading again, having another crack at Kyiv? And what Zelensky is thinking about now is building up weapons that are sufficiently powerful, not necessarily nuclear weapons, but something that is a credible deterrence. That means Putin thinks twice about invading Ukraine again. And to that end, he's looking specifically at ballistic missiles.
Right, very basic question then. What is a ballistic missile, George, and why would it be such a potent addition to Ukraine's armory?
A ballistic missile is one that kind of follows an arc. Its trajectory is going up, as opposed to a cruise missile that kind of goes flatter, closer to the Earth's surface. And it's a very destructive, it's a very powerful weapon. If you think about the kind of, Russia's most powerful weapons and the US's most powerful weapons, how do they kind of deploy their nuclear bombs? Well, they're carried on ballistic missiles. And Dnipro, where I was in Ukraine, was actually during the Soviet Union the kind of heart of this ballistic missile production. So during the Cold War, it was the center where all the Soviet Union's kind of ballistic missiles and most potent weapons were made.
Yeah, I mean, there was some reporting in the Times not so long ago, George, about certainly a report to the Ukrainian leadership about the possibility of developing a crude nuclear-armed weapon. Is there any more on that?
Well, 30 years ago, Ukraine signed something called the Budapest Memorandum, where they gave up their this was after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and Ukraine basically inherited from the Soviet Union a number of nuclear weapons, and they agreed to give them up in exchange for security assurances from the US, the UK, and America. And funnily enough, they think that was a bit of a mistake in retrospect, because they didn't get many security assurances from Russia. So the question for them is, what sort of deterrence can they build up? A nuclear weapon's a bit of a stretch. But I put it this way: I don't think Zelensky would say no if he could suddenly magic one.
Yeah, I think the suggestion was using plutonium fuel in a crude way as in the warhead of a missile. But it was a suggestion, and Zelensky himself isn't at least talking that way, is he? Now, the Ukrainians that you're talking to, George, how do they feel about the future with Donald Trump coming into the White House? Do they feel in any way resigned to the likelihood of losing that key American support, and maybe seeing European support weakening too?
Well, there was a recent poll that found a majority of Ukrainians now favor a peace deal negotiated as soon as possible. But, it hasn't really reached the level of being an open political discussion here in Kiev. It's a bit of a taboo still, because it means acknowledging that Ukraine has lost a significant portion of its territory, and that the sacrifices of a lot of people who died trying to liberate that territory might have been in vain, at least for now. So that's a very difficult political tightrope for Zelensky to walk if he does want to kind of pursue this ceasefire. But there are signs that he's starting to kind of roll the pitch for that. He said the other day he conceded that it was very unlikely that Ukraine could win back, those occupied parts of Luhansk and Donetsk. And so he does appear to be kind of resigned almost, or starting to be resigned. But then the key question is the security guarantees. What is to prevent Russia from having another go at Ukraine? And so that is why they are building long-range drones. That's why they're building long-range ballistic missiles, because that means that perhaps if there is a pause in fighting, and then Putin's kind of, builds his troops again in a couple of years to have another go, well, he would have to contemplate, for example, Moscow coming under Ukrainian attack. And that's not talking about Western weapons supplied to Ukraine. That's domestically produced weapons in Ukraine.
George, thank you so much for joining us. George Grill there. Svetlana ran for president after her husband, who's a leading opposition candidate, was arrested and jailed during the 2020 election campaign. And she fled afterwards and has been living in Lithuania as an exile ever since then. Welcome now to the programme, Svetlana.
Hi.
Yeah, good to have you here. Now, we've been given on this programme and across the news in this country and much more widely, we've been giving so much coverage to the fall of Assad in Syria. Is it right that are you taking encouragement, Svetlana, from that for the prospects, the chances of removing the regime of Lukashenko?
The situation in Syria showed us that dictators are not invincible, and dictatorship usually collapse when nobody expects this. And like it was with Berlin Wall, I don't know, it's also Soviet Union. So we as democratic forces have to be prepared for this. But also events in Syria send worrying signal to dictator in Belarus that in the case of turbulence, ally you rely on, Russia, will not rescue you. So they will accept you, in Russia, give you refuge, but they will not help you in a proper moment. And of course, it showed weakness of Russia in the moment of the attack in Ukraine. But, it's good for us because weakened Putin means weakened Lukashenko. And very soon, I hope we will gain new wind of opportunity to uprise again in Belarus.
Well, let's then talk about your hope for an uprising at the right moment. When might that be? There are elections, aren't there, Svetlana, in Belarus in January. I say elections, they are sure to be rigged elections. But it's not your view that is the time for opponents of the regime to take to the streets and act. Is that correct?
For sure, it's not the correct moment because what's going to happen in Belarus in January has nothing in common with elections. It's a farce, imitation. It's like a ritual, reappointment of Lukashenko by Lukashenko. But the situation now in Belarus, 4 years of repressions, like life like in Gulag. And this so-called election will not change a lot for Belarus because Lukashenko is still, ally to Putin. Belarusian resistance went underground, and this so-called election will not legitimize Lukashenko in the eyes of Belarusian people, and I don't want people to sacrifice in vain.
Right.
Because we have to be prepared for a really proper moment that might be connected to the victory of Ukraine or people's unrest in Belarus or some economic troubles or something else can happen in the world. So like a black swan will appear. So that's why it's not a proper moment. But of course, I ask people to resist securely, safely at this very moment. And of course, we call our democratic partners preliminarily recognize these elections as non-legitimate, as fraud, not to legitimize Lukashenko.
What then would be an appropriate time for Belarusians to act, in your view, Svetlana?
As I said before, it's the proper moment or moment of opportunity might be connected with the victory of Ukraine. That's why, the victory of Ukrainians are so important for us Belarusians. That's why we advocated so much the world to give this wonderful country and brave Ukrainians everything they need to win this war. Because they are not just fighting for themselves, they are fighting actually for many nations and for Europe as well. So this might be connected with if something happens in Russia,
yes,
or some like natural issues like health of Lukashenko. But mainly is to be prepared for this, to have strong agents of democratic forces, to have unity in democratic movement, and European world or democratic world to be prepared for these changes as well.
Right. Now, look, is it a worry with you? Are you concerned that Putin, having been humiliated by the fall of his ally in Syria, may be more likely then to defend Lukashenko if he comes under the kind of pressure you want to see?
Belarus, of course, strategically important for Russia because it might be launching a pad for attacks not only on Ukraine but also on our Western actually neighbors. But and that's why Putin is supporting Lukashenko so much. But I have to say that European world, democratic world, should not underestimate the importance of Belarus regarding democratic countries. It's so important not to leave Belarusian people one-to-one with this Russian beast. Yes. We ask you to help us to fight with dictatorship and fight with the Russian imperialism. So helping Belarusians is very small cost that influence Russia a lot because they have to pay Lukashenko more and more just to keep him as ally, to contribute to propaganda. And we as Belarusian people resist to this. Yeah. So what is worrying us that in the case of possible escalation on the battlefields of Ukraine, Belarus again can be used as launching pad for Russia. This is disturbing us, and our partisans inside the country have to be prepared for this.
Tell me, when you look at what is going on in Ukraine, and when you look at the confrontation between NATO and Russia, the political confrontation, of course, NATO is backing Ukraine, although not engaged militarily. The leader of NATO, Mark Rutte, says that NATO's not ready for a long-term confrontation with Russia. Suggests it's time to change to something like a war footing. What do you want from NATO now, in your view, as NATO looks at Russia and this potential threat?
I think that this alliance have to support all those nations who are fighting against Russia, against dictatorship. And we, people in Belarus and Ukraine, we're really brave people, but we can't win this war alone. We need strong allies. And, I think that dictators hear such words that we are not able to win, we are not be able to stay strong, for a long time. It's perceived like weakness. And they challenge NATO, alliance and democracy more and more. And it's emboldened them. So I think that alliance is strong enough to counter dictatorship, to counter Russia, and they have to play it clearly. We will confront you as long as it's necessary to win you.
Now, then, what is it that you hope for in the war in Ukraine? What is the outcome you hope to see, realistically hope to see, maybe in this coming year?
I haven't met any person, including Ukrainians, who don't want peace in Ukraine. But it should be a just peace. We can't sacrifice territories of Ukraine just to please dictators. I think that the world, it's not Ukrainian war, it's our global war for freedom. And that's why I really want to see decisiveness among democratic, strong, powerful countries regarding Ukrainians. Give this country everything they need to win the war, to defeat the dictators. And then we all together can celebrate.
Okay. Svetlana, thank you so much for talking to us. So, and let me ask you, the fall of Assad in Syria was a humiliation for Putin. Do you think it would lead him to take a harder line towards Ukraine and the terms of a possible peace?
So it's, of course, worth stepping back and asking why he's fighting in Ukraine as a way of answering that question. He's made pretty clear many times over many years, actually, not just in the last 3 years, that he doesn't believe Ukraine is a real nation, that he wants to make it part of a Russian empire or a Russian sphere of influence. He's also had the goal in this war of, in his language, changing the world order, by which he means creating a world in which he can do whatever he wants. He enjoys the same kind of impunity around the world that he enjoys at home. And it's true that the war in Syria, the loss of Assad, does mean that his ability to achieve that bigger goal, this changing the way the world works goal, is pretty severely damaged. And so that makes Ukraine really the last place where he can still do that. And I think he now has, he has even more at stake in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that he's going to be more able to fight in Ukraine, because of course what Syria also shows is that Russia is growing weaker, that it's overextended, that its military supply system is limited, and that it doesn't have the men or the equipment that it had 3 years ago.
Yes. I mean, it will mean then, do you think, that if there is to be a deal, and we'll come to that, it has to be a deal for Putin that he can present as an unambiguous victory, which maybe means, at a minimum, possession, not just occupation, but possession of the territories that are now in Russian control, in the Donbass, in Crimea?
I don't think that's our problem. In other words, it's not up to us to know what it is that Putin can or cannot sell as a victory. As he's presented this war to the Russians and to the world so far, merely possessing Crimea or Donbass, it doesn't fulfill his goals or his ambitions. Neither his goals in terms of changing the structure of world politics, nor his goals in terms of rebuilding the Russian Empire. Nor, I should say, his goals in eliminating what he considers to be an illegal, or maybe illegal is the wrong word, or an illegitimate state. He doesn't respect Ukrainian sovereignty. He doesn't think Ukraine should exist.
Right. So in that sense, he's setting the bar of attainment very high. What does that mean, though, in terms of the shape of a deal, if there's to be a deal, Anne?
So I am still mystified when people talk about a deal, because I have not heard anyone explain how the Russians will be persuaded to negotiate, or what deal they are interested in that is acceptable to anybody else. So far, all the things that they've said make it sound like the only deal they would accept is capitulation of Ukraine. So I am still waiting for someone to explain why we're talking about a deal now and why we think it's possible. I mean, of course, Zelensky has said he would negotiate. He's said that for a long time. That he's presented several different versions of a peace plan, some publicly, some privately. He would probably be willing to at least temporarily, stop fighting for some territory in exchange for a NATO presence or a European presence in Ukraine, in exchange for some kind of real security. I think I'm within bounds by guessing that that's what he would accept. But I have not heard anyone explain why the Russians would accept a deal of any kind. They have not said they would. They haven't given any public, or as far as I know, private indications that they will. So what the Trump administration, which doesn't of course exist yet, but what it will do, what its plan is to get Putin to negotiate, I don't know. I haven't heard it.
Right. So look, some of the ideas of what Donald Trump might do by way of exerting pressure on Putin have been aired publicly by people close to Donald Trump, and they come down, as far as I can see, to this: Trump would want talks. Without talks, if Putin is the one who stands back and refuses to engage, then the warning is that a Donald Trump administration would arm Ukraine to the teeth, would give them all they need to fight Putin and to fight off Russian forces. That, I think, is the essence of the supposed Trump threat.
So that is not any different from what the Biden administration is doing right now. In other words, it's also directly in conflict with what other people around Trump have said. So J.D. Vance has said almost the opposite of that we need to stop arming them right now. Donald Trump Jr. has described, Zelensky as a kind of welfare addict, whose money needs to be cut off. I don't know who speaks for the Trump administration right now. I don't know who's creating this plan. And I would just caution everybody to be very, very careful. Right now, there is no plan. Right now, there is no Russian agreement. Right now, there is no evidence of anything really of anything resembling a plan. And people are now jumping way ahead to think about, 6 steps down the road, what we should do. But the main question is, the Russians need to stop fighting. They need to understand that they've lost the war, that they cannot conquer all of Ukraine, that they will not have a pro-Russian government in Kiev, that they will not divide up Western Ukraine with other countries. That none of that is going to happen. Once they understand that, then we can have a negotiation. I have not yet seen evidence that they understand that. I'm still.
Well, indeed, yeah. There's absolutely no evidence that Vladimir Putin accepts that as a summation of where we are. But you say that the idea of further arming Ukraine would just keep us exactly where we are. There is, this perception now, and it's not unfounded, that the supporters of Ukraine are, well, some becoming rather war weary. There's more talk about, on the European side, an assumption that the peace talks will happen this year. And even aside from that, the supplies for Ukraine, it is now suggested, are not inexhaustible. That the powers of NATO on the Western side, including Britain, are already stretched. Something has to give, and they're looking to a Trump presidency to be a turning point. That seems to be a common assumption.
I think that's it's very dangerous. Trump himself knows very little about the conflict. He hasn't confronted any of the real issues. He's very interested in having it be over and done with, and he's made that clear in several conversations he's had with European leaders. He doesn't seem to have a plan, and I think betting on him coming up with one is risky. I mean, that doesn't mean that Putin, for some reasons of his own, might want to have a ceasefire or that something might happen, but right at this exact moment, as we're speaking on December the 12th, there is no evidence of any plan at all.
Yeah, I mean, I would mention one further thing discussed in Brussels over the last 48 hours, the possibility of seizing those frozen Russian assets that are held in Western and European financial institutions, amounting to maybe £300 billion. At the moment, some of the profits from that are being skimmed off. It is argued that maybe just take it, maybe just seize it and use it and give it to Ukraine.
So I have been arguing that for a long time. I completely agree. That is one of the ways that we could go. It's true that we have already taken. We've used it's a complicated process by which we've used the interest from that money as backing for loans that we've given to Ukraine. It's some tens of billions of dollars. I saw a figure of 50. Maybe it's a little bit different from that. I don't want to be wrong, but it's a lot of money, and it will go to propping up the Ukrainian budget and keeping the state running and so on. So it's not nothing. But yes, absolutely, the $300 billion or 300 billion euros, I think it is absolutely something we should now consider, taking permanently, using it to buy weapons and using it to win the war. I've thought that for a long time. I mean, there were some doubts about it in that, people are worried about the precedents and so on, but we're coming to the point of emergency. In other words, we're going to need to keep supporting Ukraine if we don't want, some kind of Ukrainian collapse or some kind of disaster, which would then create a more expensive problem for us. I mean, this is what I think is also really important for people to understand. If Ukraine were to lose, we would not save money.
Yes.
It would not be cheaper. A war ending with the Russian conquest of Ukraine would create a whole series of other disasters, refugees, economic problems, political problems, plus a brand new military problem for Europe. And it is foolish to imagine that ending the war in that way would be good for anybody. I mean, least of all, of course, the Ukrainians, who would then be subject to a regime not unlike the one that we've just seen fall in Syria, where people are arrested arbitrarily, they're kept in dark prisons, they're disappeared, they're tortured. That's what happens on the territory of occupied Ukraine now. That's what's happening right now in the eastern Ukrainian territories taken in 2022.
Yeah.
And that's what would happen to the whole state. And that would be a crisis of a different kind.
Yeah, you make a very powerful case. In some ways, this is maybe an unfair question, and taking completely aboard your argument that there is generally a distance between what Donald Trump says and what Donald Trump means, and maybe a further distance between all of that and what actually happens. But when you close your eyes and just imagine, what do you imagine is going to happen in this coming year where Ukraine is concerned? And I realize sometimes the answer to a question like that is, I haven't got a clue.
I just don't like imagining. Sorry, I don't like guessing. I'm only telling you what I see now.
Yeah.
And what I see now is that there's a very, very steep learning curve that both Trump and first of all, Trump will have to decide from among the many different voices around him who are saying completely different things, almost opposite things. He will have to decide which one of those voices is the one he wants to listen to. So that's the first thing. Secondly, he will have to decide, whether he wants, what his level of investment in this issue is, which is probably going to be the most difficult thing he has to face immediately. I mean, there'll be other crises down the road. I have no idea whether he's thinking about it now, whether he's working on it, whether he's made any move in the direction of giving himself a greater understanding of the issues or not. I do know that he's spoken to several European leaders about it. And there are two things that we know. One is that he wants it off his plate. He doesn't want to think about it. He doesn't care about this issue. He wants it to go away, which is, of course, really foolish because it's not going to go away by itself. But secondly, we know that he's afraid of some kind of catastrophe scenario that would then make him look bad. So he's worried about what he will look like. And so we know those two things about him. Other than that, I really think it's important for people to kind of step back and understand that we don't have any idea what he'll do. He doesn't think strategically in the way that other people do. He doesn't have a goal that he wants to achieve. What he wants is for the story to disappear from the newspapers, and he doesn't have a strategy to get there. So let's wait and see whose advice he decides to take.
Anne Applebaum, good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
We've been covering the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who fled the country and has reportedly sought asylum in Russia. One element that we wanted to look at is how this affects the war in Ukraine, and no better person to do it with than Caelan Robertson. He's a journalist in Kyiv. He's been documenting the war there for the last 6 months, lived over there for 4 months, has been to multiple frontline destinations. Good evening, Caelan. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's just focus on Syria, first of all, and the impact of this change in regime, potentially, in Syria, and how Russia and what's happening where you are in Kyiv, how all that pulls into the story.
Well, look, this is massively connected to Ukraine. Yesterday morning when I woke up and saw that the Assad regime had finally fallen, I instantly started looking at what that meant for Putin and what that meant for Ukraine, and it is massive. Putin's standing on the world stage has been diminished by what has happened in the last 48 hours in Syria. Some of their biggest naval bases, some of their biggest military bases that allow Russia to operate on the Mediterranean, carry out their operations in North Africa, have now been diminished, if not destroyed. That makes Putin look weak, and that makes Putin pretty unstable on the world stage. there are military bases and naval bases that are probably going to be taken in the next few days as well that are Russian in Syria. And this was Putin's crown jewel in the Middle East. This was his military stronghold. He has pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into the Assad regime for the last number of decades. And that regime has just fallen, and Assad has just fled to Moscow. And that looks terrible for Putin, which is quite good if you're a supporter of Ukraine. If you live in this country, I woke up yesterday morning, Sunday morning, I could hear church bells ringing. And I made a video talking about how it's actually quite cathartic seeing this, because this was something that Putin had as a stronghold for a long time. And he likes to put out this very strongman image of himself across the world. A lot of people get scared whenever he puts out these, I would say, fake nuclear threats. And this is a huge blow to his image. So it was nice. It was nice waking up yesterday morning and seeing such a monumental blow. And I'm very good friends with Paul Conroy. He was obviously with Marie Coven when she died in Homs in Syria in 2012. And he said that he was ecstatic about this. He's the first person that I called, because it's not just about diminishing Putin's power. It's also a regime that should have fallen. It was a deeply disturbing regime. We've now seen stories of political prisoners that have been held and crushed and killed and murdered and tortured. And regardless of who's going to replace Assad, Assad should have fallen. So it means a lot. As a reporter here in Ukraine as well, it's a fantastic moment just before Christmas.
Now, look, over there, you've been making different films about your experiences. You've been to several frontline areas. I was watching one recently where you were in Kherson, and you were looking at drone warfare, effectively. Let's just get a taste of some of your work.
There's a place where science fiction meets Mad Max. 300 times a day, the Russians use drones to kill civilians in a city called Kherson. They can blow a hole in your window and send another drone right inside.
And that goes on for several minutes more, and it charts, well, things like you getting your mobile phone potentially tapped by Russia. I mean, tell us about some of your experiences over there covering the war.
Well, I visited Kherson for the first time in 2023, just months after its liberation with John Sweeney. We were making a documentary about war crimes there, and the threat in Kherson back then was artillery and missiles. The Russians were pushed south of the river, they blew the bridges, and now they hammer that city from the south of the river. And that's what the threat was. It was artillery incoming and outgoing. I got on a bus about 2 months ago to Kherson to film an update on what was going on there. My close friend Zarina Zabriskie was filming there, saying, Kaelan, there are incredible amounts of drone attacks happening right now against innocent civilians, up to 300 a day. And it was almost too shocking to believe. The second I got off that bus, I realized how much things had changed in the last year. Artillery had been diminished, and the new threat was drone warfare, and I was completely unprepared for it. So I started walking through the streets of Kherson. I was on the phone to my mom. I was on the phone to friends. I was filming things, and suddenly a drone started hovering right above me with a grenade attached to it that was trying to drop that grenade and kill me. I had to hide between the tree covers. I had to basically rely on Mother Nature to protect me. And I wasn't prepared for how fast warfare had changed in that city. From 2023, artillery, right, which is basically redundant now, it's now basically drone warfare. And the drones dominate the skies in Kherson. The drone pilots all across south of the river in that city. Think of it as London. There's a River Thames. The Russians get pushed south of it, and then they basically become FPV pilots, and they drop drones on random civilians and buses there every single day. It was unbelievable. I have never seen anything like it. I've never been so terrified in my life. And there's a certain feeling about seeing a drone right above you, knowing that someone with remote control is looking at you, ready to hit that button, and you can't see them back. And it's a terrifying look into the future of warfare, into the future of what battlefields are going to look like.
Yeah.
And Kherson was ground zero. And this is what is now being used all across the Eastern Front in this country. After that happened, after I was specifically targeted by drones, I became obsessed with how they work and where the future is with this. So there was I basically traveled 2,000 kilometers across the front line from Pokrovsk all the way into Suja in Russia 2 weeks ago, embedding myself with drone units to find out how they're built, how they work, and how they crash. This is actually a Russian drone that crashed into the car in front of us. You can see the
wow. So you're going to hold this up to our camera. Sadly, our listeners will have to check this out on YouTube or on our socials. So that is a Russian drone. Just describe what it looks like, because it looks pretty basic to me.
Well, these things are basic. This is why they're so effective, because you don't need massive artillery anymore. You don't need tanks. You don't need huge munitions. You need a $300 piece of aluminum like this that can specifically target anyone you want within 20 kilometers. This, if you're listening right now, is a drone I'm holding that was made in Russia that crashed in front of our car 2 weeks ago with a bent front propeller. And how it works is you basically have a camera on the front here, and this will fly at about 60 kilometers an hour, and it will crash into you. If you've ever seen any of these videos on Twitter of FPV crashes and soldiers being killed, that's what they look like. The Ukrainians have developed slightly better versions of it. This is a drone that was made in Ukraine about 2 weeks ago, and they have actually 3D printed some middle fingers on the front of it, because when these two wires make contact, before they hit you, this is what happens. This will be used in about 2 weeks as well.
So that looks much more sophisticated. It kind of looks like it's not made in someone's workshop, a bit like the Russian one. That one looks neat. It looks much more advanced.
Well, the Ukrainians are developing drone technology at breakneck speed in this country. This is why I became obsessed with it as well. I went to secret warehouses all across central and northern Ukraine in the last few weeks and watched how they were developing different frequencies, different types of jamming systems. There are now new types of drones which basically have massive propellers with 3 drones on each one that can drop them from that drone, and you can launch 6 at a time. I mean, this is just unbelievable technology.
My gosh,
and
it's like kind of movie script time. So one like mother drone, basically then all the baby drones, sorry this is so basic, but all the baby drones kind of launch off that sort of mothership drone.
And this is just the beginning. That's just 6 drones launching from one mother drone. In the future, you could maybe launch 1,000 drones as a swarm from a cargo ship. And that is where things are going. When we look at the future of warfare, you look at Chinese drone shows, drone shows. They're not just drone shows for entertainment for the general public. They are shows of military might. And the future of warfare will be that. Because if you can get an artillery shell and you can launch it out of ammunition, and you have to be dependent on where the wind is blowing, and you don't really know where it's going to land. If you can get that shell and you can put 4 propellers on it, and you can put a camera on the front of it, and you can make sure it lands specifically where you want to, then there's no need to have any other type of weapon.
And there's no loss of human life in terms of direct warfare on the ground. Obviously, the drone's going to be targeting something, but it takes a lot of pressure off either side having to provide armed personnel on the ground. Look, it's so fascinating to speak to you. You can check out Caelan Robertson.
We have the former Shadow Culture Secretary Thangam Debonair. She's in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And we also have the Sunday Times' Dominic Lawson. Good morning, Dominic.
Good morning. The brutal 50-year regime in Syria has collapsed in weeks. What can be done to make what comes next better than rule by the Assads? Should the UK try to influence events, or should we be leaving well alone?
Thangam, you have a friend who has family in Syria, and they are celebrating.
Yes, so I spent a lot of the weekend in communication with my friend who's a Syrian woman who lives now in London. And she talked to me a lot about what it's been like for the last 50 years. She was brought up to think Ila Alabad Ya Assad, which, because it rhymes, really sticks in the mind, and it means Assad forever. And she said she was taught, as they all were, that there was only one way, and it was the way of Assad. Now, obviously, then she came to live here, and one of the things she really noticed when she watched me as an opposition politician was the stark contrast between a democracy and not. She used to say, in my country, if you said any of those things, you would be in prison, and only if you were lucky would you not be tortured and possibly killed. Now, after 50 years of totalitarianism, you mentioned, what happens next? And I think it's really important that we don't make the mistakes we've made in the past, but the international community has a real role to play here. We have to help support what happens in Syria. There is civil society. There are multiple communities. It's not an individual sort of homogeneous nation. And yes, at the moment, of course, people are celebrating the fact they're free of Assad. What nobody wants, I'm sure, is to see one regime, one totalitarian regime being replaced by another. There are ways that that can be done, but I think we need to be looking at, and I'm sure the UK government is, whether, and if so when, we lift sanctions, because there's been so much suffering. The deadly trade in Captagon, which is a very nasty drug, which has been flooding from Syria into neighbouring countries, that obviously has to be tackled. We also need to make sure that whatever happens, it happens peacefully. So far, that seems to be mainly the case. So, I'm hopeful, but only cautiously. And that reflects the friends of my good friend, Reem, who's been talking, obviously, to her friends over the weekend and her family.
Dominic, we've had the government spokesperson on this morning, Pat McFadden, and he's repeated this to many outlets. He said that that the government needs to look at potentially prescribing as a terrorist organisation HTS, which is not necessarily going to be the whole government, but will probably be part of it in some way. Are you worried about that?
No, it seems quite sensible. I mean, you ask, what should be Britain's role? What is our special place? Well, one of the interesting things is, of course, that Bashar al-Assad studied ophthalmology, was a practicing ophthalmologist in London. His wife is British.
Yeah.
They are now holed up, as we're told, somewhere near Moscow. I think, therefore, we have a peculiar link. And to the extent that we should do anything, we should be leading the campaign to have Assad brought to justice in an international court or elsewhere. And where is the money, the billions that his family have abstracted, leaving the country poverty-stricken, and as Sangam says, therefore, reliant on basically the drugs trade. So I think there is also the question, about 13 million people were displaced as a result of the Syrian civil war. How is their return managed? What can we do to assist in that? That's more of an issue in Germany, where many more settled, because the country needs its people to rebuild itself.
What about Shamima Begum? She's in a camp in northern Syria, and someone made the point that I think it was Pat McFadden made the point that actually it's a different group that control that territory. I understand that all kind of legal avenues of her coming back here, etc., they've been exhausted now. But what are your thoughts on her position, Dominic?
I have very little thoughts on that, because I don't think that should be the priority of the British government or now of the British people. The issue is what is happening in Syria, in the Middle East. And by the way, something that we haven't yet mentioned, which is that we should rejoice that it is an extraordinary humiliation for Putin. If you remember, essentially, Assad was only kept in power by Putin, by Russian military support, naval support. And Putin broadcast this as a triumph of Russian diplomacy against the West. And if you look at Russian Telegram, social media, there is absolute fury in Russia. There is absolute humiliation. And I think that we should be rejoicing at this. The fact that the Russian naval forces have had to scuttle from their base in Syria, having already been driven out of Sebastopol, I think there's not nearly enough, cheering at what has happened in the context of the biggest threat to peace and democracy in Europe that we have faced since the Second World War.
There seems to be a lot of cheering, and you can understand why. You explained yourself that if you've been under a particular under the boot for 53 years, you are, of course, going to celebrate because you're reunited, perhaps with family members. You find out what happened to people, where they went. You're able to do things that you were not able to do before. And yet, I mean, a lot of people have got in touch and said the thing about, getting rid of dictators is what comes next is not always it's not always milk and honey, is it? And that must be a concern in some people's minds.
Of course, I think it should be a concern in everybody's minds, and two things can be true at the same time. We can rejoice that a people are free of a brutal regime that's been there for 53 years and be concerned and therefore want to step up onto the world stage to support what happens next, being peaceful and working towards some form of representation, some form of democracy. I am cautiously optimistic only, but I think there's also a really interesting thing. I mean, Dominic rightly mentions Russia. There's also what has this done to the various other axes of power and influence, such as with Lebanon, with Iran, and what that might do to tilt different power across the Middle East. I think that's really interesting, and we all have skin in that game. We need the Middle East to be stable, and goodness knows it's not. The suffering in Gaza continues. Those hostages still haven't been returned, and we still have Lebanon being attacked and retaliating with also a prescribed terrorist group, Hezbollah, who should have been weakened by the fall of Assad. But that's a complex set of relationships. And a simple way of perhaps summing up some of the hope that I feel is that this will have tilted power away from brutal dictators. What we don't want to happen now is for brutal dictatorship to be replaced by another form of oppression. There's some cautiously optimistic signs here.
How safe or how much of a life is Bashar al-Assad, his wife and his 3 children going to have in Russia, do you think? We saw these amazing pictures of the Syrian rebel flag being hoisted outside the Syrian embassy in Moscow, which seemed unusual. But I mean, some people, we had Peter Frankopan on, the professor of global history at the University of Oxford, and he said if I was Bashar al-Assad, I'd be very worried and I wouldn't stand near any open windows.
He might be safer if he submits himself to voluntary being brought to the International Criminal Court, as Dominic has mentioned. I think there are crimes. Let's not forget, he gassed his own citizens.
Yes.
He put them into abject poverty. He tortured and disappeared hundreds of thousands of people, who some of whom have survived their years in prison, but many of whom will not have done, all of whom will have been scarred by that experience. He ground his people into poverty, and yet Syria has immense capability. Anyone who knows anything about Syrian culture and Syrian history will know that, for example, there is still civic life in parts of Syria that reflects some of what was there before, but there's also been the systematic destruction of some cultural aspects which really do matter, such as the monuments at Palmyra.
Pat McFadden said that the government can consider de-prescribing HTS. Are you relaxed about that?
I don't think Pat's relaxed about it, but I think he's right. They can consider it, and I think they should consider it, because at the moment we have sanctions against Syria because of Assad. Assad is gone. But if we want to relax those sanctions, we have to be careful about who is going to benefit. We want the Syrian people to benefit, and that's really important. And it may be that the government has to consider the status of HTS as a result.
Do you think the time is now to effectively force Zelensky and Ukraine to the negotiating table?
Well, I would rather that the Ukrainians were doing better on the ground when negotiations start. I think we, the West, have been slow to supply them with the kind of kit they needed, and have retained for too long restrictions on how they use it. I'm also a little bit worried that we could be at a 1938 moment. When Chamberlain went to Munich, it was to save Czechoslovakia. He agreed to a partition of Czechoslovakia and gave up half of it. Hitler said that was it. He would settle for that, fine. And in 6 months' time, he took the other half. It seems to me that if there's a settlement which involves the Russians retaining Donetsk and Luhansk, then the chances are they'll come back in due course for more. As Putin has made pretty clear. I mean, Putin, who originally was in favor of a relationship between Russia and an independent Ukraine, provided that Ukraine did not join NATO, didn't mind about it joining the EU. He has since developed a doctrine about Ukraine being an illegitimate state, no right to national sovereignty, run by neo-Nazis, and needing to be restored to the Russian homeland. I suspect that that's what he really believes. And therefore, I suspect that any partition of Ukraine would be short-lived. So I'm all in favor of negotiations. The degree of death, of destruction in this war is appalling, and very, very heavy, and it's gone on for 2 years. I'm all in favor of an armistice negotiations and a peace settlement, but not if it involves a partition of Ukraine.
And if we take your 1938 analogy, are we in this country deluding ourselves not just on the idea of establishing some kind of permanent settlement, but also on the amount which we need to spend on our own security and armed forces?
Yes, I think so, Adam. I mean, when the Labour government came in '97, we were spending about 4% of GDP on defence. We had been spending about 5% when John Major came in. We're now spending 2.2, 2.3%, and we're having a political discussion about whether and when we should move to 2.5% of GDP. This is out of scale. We lived off the peace dividend for too long. We didn't understand Mr. Putin when he first came in. We hoped for a relationship between Russia and NATO. Yeltsin, after all, signed a treaty with NATO, the founding act in '98. We have a different Russia now, an irredentist Russia, which is an existential threat to European security. The frontline states, those closest to Russia in NATO, are well aware of that. The Poles are spending 4% of GDP in defense and increasing it steeply. The Baltic states, the Greeks, they're all spending far more than we are as a proportion of GDP. I think it's good that the Labour government have said they want to increase defence expenditure. I think it's very good that they've set up a defence review under George Robertson, who is as an ex-Secretary General of NATO, knows these dossiers, as well as Defence Secretary, knows these dossiers very, very well. But I think we're in a fool's paradise if we think that 2.5% of GDP will do the job. We have hollowed out armed forces. We spend on the military a quarter of what we spend on the National Health Service. I think we are going to have to wake up, smell the coffee, and realize that our front line, the front line of our defense, is the eastern frontier of NATO and President Zelensky's heroic resistance in Ukraine. I do think that among the priorities for any government has to be the first task of government, which is to ensure the security of the people.
What would you say to former Chief of Defence Staff General Richards, who simply says, look, in the end, Ukraine has never been a strategic priority for the United Kingdom, and therefore, in a sense, he implies that we're throwing good money and good resources like long-range missiles after bad?
Well, I disagree with him. I think that the strategic priority of the United Kingdom is retaining independent West European countries. I think that the Finns and the Swedes, when they decided to join NATO in reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, were recognizing a reality. I myself thought it was a mistake that we offered Ukraine membership of NATO. I thought that was rather provocative to Russians. My own 10 years ago, 15 years ago, my own view was that what we wanted was to replicate what happened in 1955. I'm very old, but I wasn't around then. 1955, the Austrians decided autonomously that they wanted to be perpetually neutral. They didn't want to join anybody's alliance. And their decision was ratified by the four powers who were occupying Austria at the time: the Americans, the French, the British, and the Russians. And within 3 months, the Russians withdrew all 150,000 troops from Austria, and Austria was never threatened by the Warsaw Pact in the years that followed. I think it would be a rather sound relationship with Russia to have a neutral state in between the alliance and the Russians. And that was the position that I was in. But it's very difficult now, after they've lost so many people, after there have been so many atrocities. Remember Bucha. It's very hard to tell the Ukrainians that they are not entitled to Western security guarantees. So if there were to be a peace settlement between the West and the Ukraine, which involved, as I trust it would, an independent Ukraine retaining its national sovereignty, then very strong security guarantees would have to be given. And we would have to mean them this time. We did give security guarantees to Ukraine when they gave up all their nuclear weapons in 1994. We gave them security guarantees, and so, of course, did the Russians. And the Russians have torn them up. And we have to remember that precedent, and we have to make sure that we're not conned again by Russia.
And I know you say Ukraine is the focus, but obviously there are very major developments taking place in Syria. Donald Trump, however, has said Syria is a mess. It's not our friend. The United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. Do you think that with a clean conscience, the UK can say the same thing?
I don't know very much about Mr. Jalani, whose forces have reached Damascus. I do know that President Assad was a butcher who murdered a huge number of people who maintained chemical weapons and used them. I can't mourn him. I don't know what is going to emerge in Syria, but I don't think the fall of Assad is bad news.
The question I was really asking is looking at British foreign policy, whether we bear any responsibility for the chaos that's been there.
In Syria, no, I don't think so. I think we bear considerable responsibility for the situation in Iraq, obviously, and some for the situation in Afghanistan. Some, if you go back far enough, for the situation in Iran. But Syria, we were never the colonial power in Syria, and I don't think we bear a lot of responsibility for the situation there now. David Cameron wanted to act against Assad, wanted to bomb Damascus, and the House of Commons said no. And the House of Lords, I also said no, not the House of Lords matters very much. David Cameron said, I hear you, and we did not, and therefore neither did our ally Obama at the time. Maybe that was a mistake, but I'd say it was a good mistake, because I don't think we knew what we were going to do next if we had bombed Damascus, and I'm very glad we didn't.
Lord Kerr, thank you very much indeed for joining us this Sunday.
The head of NATO has warned members are not ready for the threats it'll face from Russia in the coming years, and that it's time to adopt a wartime mindset. Mark Rutte said NATO countries should be spending much higher on defence than the current target of 2% of GDP.
We are not ready for what is coming our way in 4 to 5 years. Danger is moving towards us at full speed. We must not look the other way. We must face it. What is happening in Ukraine could happen here too. And regardless of the outcome of this war, we will not be safe in the future unless we are prepared to deal with danger.
Mark Rutte speaking earlier there. Well, Jonathan Shaw is former Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff and joins me now. Good evening, Jonathan.
Good evening.
Let's talk about the UK's readiness. Quite some words here from Mark Rutte. Are we ready in the UK to be on a wartime footing?
Yes, I think we need to remind ourselves what a wartime footing might look like. All the focus is on defense spending, but actually I think what we're learning already is that the modern era of war needs to be redefined and rethought of as something much broader than just the military. It's a whole of society activity. And so this is about the mobilizing the potential of the whole of society, not just increasing spending on defense. So from that point of view, I think he's absolutely right that we're still thinking of war as a sort of military-only activity. We only need to look at the interference of what's happening, cutting cables in the Baltic Sea, things like that. Those are warlike activities. Make no mistake about it. And we need to take a much broader look at war and mobilize society to cope with it.
How do we do that? If we're to explain what you mean by that, it's not just defence spending, it's not just the instruction that comes from government on how much is spent on weapons and on defensive measures. It's also about our mindset, about our readiness. What are we talking about there specifically? What haven't we got at the moment, Jonathan Shaw, that we really should be turning our attention to?
Okay, well, we've already started with made a start in the field of cyber. We have finally tried to catch up with the Estonians, who, when they were taken to cleaners by the Russians in 2007, they formed a cyber defense league, which was basically everyone who was concerned with IT became a civilian adjunct to the state's cyber force. So it didn't matter how many earrings or ponytails or whatever you had, if you were capable at cyber, you became part of the National Reserve. We need to adopt that sort of model. Well, we've done that now, eventually in Britain, and that sort of cyber reserve, I understand, is taking shape, and that's good. And we need to do that all the way along. There's all sorts of resilience we can give ourselves. You can think of engineering, you could think of manufacturing, you could think of, the cottage industries. We could do all sorts of things if people were going to take this seriously. So there's all sorts we can do.
What else concerns you when you look at the picture, when you look at the UK's readiness for war, which is very plainly what we're talking about here, isn't it? Let's not kid ourselves. We're not opening up a storybook. We are having a serious conversation about being ready for war. Where else are we lacking?
Well, let's talk about defence then. I mean, he was talking about the aiming for 3%. We in Britain are very complacent about the fact that our current defence spending is over 2% of the of GDP. But we just need to take into account two things. First of all, in 1982, when we were fighting the Falklands War, we were something over 4% of GDP. And the comparable figure now, and I'll explain this in a minute, is that we're on 1.7% of GDP. And by saying that, that's much less than the government announces, because hidden in there, in 2010 in the Defence Review, George Osborne as Chancellor added the nuclear capability, the cost of the nuclear deterrent, onto the defence budget. So that is a hidden cost which absorbs a big and increasing amount of the defense budget. So if you're going to compare our defense spending now to what our defense spending was the last time we faced a fully geared up Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, then we are way behind the curve on this sort of investment. So I think we really do have to get very serious about how much we're spending on defense, not disregarding the fact that we are short of money anyway.
Where does the immediate threat come from? I'm just keen to sort of drill into your expertise, your experience, and also you will have a strong sense of where the threats are at the moment. We can talk about Russia, we can talk about the situation in the Middle East, but also China as well. That is something that Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, talked about today. We must be clear-eyed about China's ambitions, says Beijing was building up its forces with no transparency and no limitations. Where is the immediate threat if we're trying to get our heads around this picture at the moment?
So in the grand strategic position, there was a while ago when we were going to be really on the case of global Britain, we were investing in our ability to intervene in the Far East. I think that was way over ambitious for us. And indeed, Lloyd Austin, the Sec Dev in the United States, said that he wished the United Kingdom would focus on the defense of Europe rather than try and help out in the Pacific, which was, and I think he was absolutely right. That was right when he said it, and I think it's even more the case now as the Russian threat grows. So that's the first point, concentrate on Europe. On Europe, I think there are two threats. One is what we do about ourselves and our own defense. But I think more immediately, the immediate challenge is to ensure that Europe supports Ukraine, because that is the crucial battle that if we win, as in if we don't lose in Ukraine, and that's a whole different question of what those words mean. But if Russia is seen to win in Ukraine, then I think that's when we really will need to look to our own national defense, because this won't be the end of it. And so that's why the key point at the moment is to put resources into supporting Ukraine.
What does that look like? This won't be the end of it. If Putin is or perceives that he has victory in Ukraine, maybe he can hang on to the territory that he has claimed as Russian occupied already. Maybe there are concessions. Maybe the arrival of Donald Trump means that process is accelerated. Where would he or what would he be emboldened to do next, do you fear?
Going to use a strange word here, but he'd nibble. He would nibble to test us and test our abilities. He'd nibble at Georgia.
How would he do that, though, Jonathan?
Well, you've seen already what his tactics are. If it's little green men or it's little, he would take a little bit. He would chomp a little bit and try and break. Well, what people tend to do, this is I remember an Israeli describing the way the Iranians reacted to red lines. They'd break red lines down into little pink lines. And they do a little one, they nibble it, and it's not quite big enough to trigger a big response. What I think they'd actually do, if you look at a map of Europe, Belarus at the moment is stuck out right into the west and looks quite exposed. To its north, it's got the Baltics, and to the south, it's got Ukraine. If Ukraine goes to the west, joins NATO, then it leaves Belarus looking very exposed. If Ukraine falls to Russia, then it is the Baltics that look very exposed and very vulnerable to some sort of lightning attack from Kaliningrad in the west, that little enclave that the Russians have there, or from the east. So you can see the temptation would be there, and the temptation in Transnistria down there, or in Moldova, and also down in Georgia. So you can see all sorts of opportunities for mischief making by Russia, and that would really force us to consider, how wide are our defences? We made these commitments under NATO, so we want to honour them. Yeah.
So, in your opinion, really we need to concentrate on Europe, and that means Vladimir Putin and Russia. This is despite an unstable region in the Middle East. This is despite the threat of China and their ambitions, of course, which know no limitations, as Mark Rutte said today. You strongly feel that this wartime mindset really first and foremost needs to be concentrating on Europe.
Well, yes, but go back to what I said right at the start. The Chinese in particular do not see war as just an activity of the military. The very strong doctrine that they have, which sees sort of competition between states taking place on all vectors of society. So, their cyber attacks, where they have successfully stolen our intellectual property over the years, and that's one of the reasons why they are now the manufacturing center of the world and are looking set to do serious damage to the industrial base of Europe, which has a fundamental effect to us and will affect us all in the years to come. So that's an instance where we need to take China very seriously in a non-military sense, but in an industrial sense, in industrial espionage sense, in a cyber sense. So yes, we have to take China seriously, but in terms of military aspects, I think our military focus should actually be in Europe, and we should, as the Americans have encouraged us to do, leave the China issue to the Americans.
Really good to speak to you. Thank you, Jonathan Shaw, former Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff. Good to talk to you.